Hey guys, hope you're all doing okay. This is Roguehat and welcome to the complete tutorial of Dolphin, the Wii emulator. In this video, you will find everything that you need to know about the emulator, how to set up the emulator, and what do all the options mean. As always, this is going to be a detailed video with included timestamps. I do, however, recommend watching the entire guide if you want the in-depth understanding of the emulator. As always, these are the minimum specifications and these are the recommended specifications. So without further ado, let's get started. Dolphin was introduced back in 2003, but the developers did not make it open source back then. It was a free-to-use emulator that could boot GameCube titles with varying degrees of success. As time passed by, they made the emulator open source from 2008. Eventually, the support for Wii was added to the emulator. It's funny that now this emulator is known for Wii instead of GameCube. I remember booting Resident Evil 4 demo for GameCube in 2010 on Wii emulator and it would just crash on the first cutscene. I think my crappy PC was to blame, but I digress. The performance of the emulator depends on your clock speed. As I mentioned before in my earlier guides, majority of the emulators out there use single core instructions per cycle. This means that you can have 52 cores, but it's not going to make any noticeable difference. If your clock speed isn't that competent, that is, but if you are dual core and your clock speed is like 5 GHz, there will be a more noticeable difference and more noticeable boost in performance. Single core is easier to implement than multi-core because of all the architectural limits of the console. All it can do is make sure that every process that's running in the background can go to the cores that Dolphin isn't using, hence giving you a slight performance boost. Before we download this emulator, please install the latest DX web setup, Visual C++ redistributables 2010 to 2019, both x86 and x64 versions. I mentioned this in every single one of my guides, and it's funny that still people come to me in comments with issues that are related to those runtime errors just because they don't have those libraries installed. So please always have them installed, but as always, I'm always happy to help. So if you're having any issue, please let me know in the comments. There are 3 ways to download this emulator. One is the nightly build, which the developers call the unstable release, and the other one is the beta build, which is like the unstable release, but most of the changes are approved, meaning it is slightly more stable than the nightly build. The third one is the most stable release of them all, the stablest release. We're gonna go with the beta release. If you have a relatively high-end PC, please go with the stable release. I personally believe that the amount of revisions this emulator has had, you're not gonna get any noticeable performance gains by using nightly builds if you're using OpenGL or Direct3D. However, if you're using Vulkan, then I recommend trying the nightly builds as well. So let's just say Dolphin emulator download, just the first one, and these are beta versions that I mentioned just now. You can download these Windows x64 and Mac OS or Android, and it's kind of amazing that this emulator is available on Android, but I think you can also use this guide for Windows as a guide for Android, but you have to use the low-end options because they're not on par with the PC. And these are the development versions, the nightly builds that I was talking about. So we're just gonna download this one, the most recent one. It was 2 weeks ago, 1 day ago, the commit that happened. So we would just download this one. It's a 7-zip file. That means you would just extract it, and that's it. So after you've extracted the file, it's gonna look something like this. Yep. And this is the original file, and this is something that I extracted from it. So we're just gonna launch the dolphin.exe. And the first time you launch it, because I launched it before, the first time you're gonna launch it, you're gonna get a prompt saying that, do you want to send anonymous statistic data to Dolphin? And you can select yes or no. So it's totally up to you if you want to help out those guys and send information about errors. Your profile is completely going to be anonymized, so it's not going to send any personal info. But in my personal opinion, it's an additional task, and I hate additional tasks. Like, it is a computational task no matter how lightweight it might be, so I always like no. but if you want to support the developers, you can by doing that. So now we're in the emulator, and let's go to the UI and see what we're working with. First up, this is our graphics window. Anything that happens is going to be in here. Our gameplay is going to be rendered in here, and these are the quick options. Open, if you want to open the file, refresh, play, stop, full screen, screenshot, config, graphics, and controllers. Pretty self-explanatory. Now let's go up to here and see them in a little bit more detail. And in file we have open, change disk, eject disk, boot from DVD backup. So if you have a DVD backup, you're rocking one of those old low spec machines, you can also use a DVD to boot your games, and then you can exit as well. In emulation we have play, reset, toggle full screen, frame advance, take, screenshot, load, screen load states, save state, select save state slot. So that's all that you have in emulation. Pretty self-explanatory again. Frame advance is a technique that tool assisted gameplays use to make sure that they can put the exact command at the exact time that they want. In movie we have start, play, stop, export, read-only, task, input. Again, this is the thing that I mentioned, tool assisted gameplay. So if you want to customize your inputs at the exact frame, then you can use this one. Pause at the end of movie, show lag counter, frame counter, put display, show system clock. Yeah, so up until here, these are the tool assisted gameplay tools that you can use to make that perfect gameplay and use combos and everything. In options you have configuration, graphics settings, audio settings, control settings, hotkey settings, and free lock settings. I'm gonna get into that in just a little bit. In tools we have resource pack manager. Now the resource pack manager is actually a really interesting tool. It's basically your packet manager. PC gamers must be familiar with this one. Whenever you want to install a custom texture or removing an existing one, you can use these package managers. It's kind of like the modes for PC games, but you can install the high definition texture or some customized texture, so it's totally up to you. So I think it's a really good feature. And then in tools we have cheats manager, pretty self-explanatory. FIFO player is for debugging your titles. Devs can use this to trace the exact commands by having it play frame by frame in most scenarios. And then we have start net play, browse start net play session if you want to play online, load GameCube main menu. So remember when you booted up GameCube and it just dropped you in their main menu, so you can actually select it from here if you want to Japan region, USA region, or the England region. And then we have memory card manager if you want to import or export your save games. This can also be used to actually get the save data from your GameCube or Wii, so you can use it for various purposes. Load Wii system menus. We haven't booted into any game, so it's grayed out. Install WAD, that's the extension for our game, or if you any of the application you want to install. Then manage NAND import, so you can import or export, and you can also check NANDs for errors. Extract certificates from NAND, so if you want the firmware and you want to validate those firmware, you can actually extract the certificates from NAND. So in that way your firmware will be valid and you can actually boot into them, because if you boot without the certificates, it's going to give you a validation error. So that's how you would go about things. Perform online system update, pretty self-explanatory. Import vsave, export vsave, connect V mode. So if you have V mode, you can connect to from here. Remember to make sure that your Bluetooth should be on. I'm gonna go into detail regarding this in just a little bit, and in the controller section. And in view we have show log configuration, show toolbar, lock widgets in place. So that's your UI settings basically. And in help we have all these things. So I highly recommend supporting these guys on Patreon. These are some really good options, and considering how much time and effort went into making this emulator, I highly recommend that. So first up, let's go to options and go to configuration. So in general settings we have enabled dual core speed up. So pretty self-explanatory, means that it's gonna use your dual cores. I'm not actually sure that if you have 5 cores or 6 cores, whether it can utilize those cores efficiently. But as I mentioned before, it's mostly dependent on your single core instructions per cycle, so it's gonna help in that case. But if you're running a lot of things in the background, then dual core can help. Enable cheats is pretty self-explanatory. You can enable cheats if you want. Allow mismatched region settings, so if you want to boot let's say USA NTSEU instead of NTSEJ, so it would take care of that. Change this system automatically. Yep. If you want to boot into Action Replay, then you want to boot into a game, then you can select this option. Show current game on Discord. I don't use Discord, so I don't have it enabled. Auto update settings beta once a month. Yep, because that's the update frequency of the emulator itself. Fallback region. So what's the default fallback region should be, whether you whenever you're booting a game. So it says NTSEU, and I think this is the best setting to select, because PAL is basically limited to 50 frames per second, but all these other ones are actually can go up to 60 frames per second. Dolphins will use these titles for whose region cannot be determined automatically. Yep, all good. Use a statistic reporting setting. I haven't enabled it, as I mentioned before, but if you want to enable it, that's fine. You can also generate a new statistic ID, which is completely going to be anonymous, but it will take track this emulator to some extent. So this emulator is going to have a unique ID, but it's going to have nothing to do with your personal information. In interface, we have system language. Theme is clean, or you can select the theme so it's like white. I don't care about these options, but if it's up your alley, then you can select these options. Use built-in database for games. Yep, custom user style game covers. You can use the game covers as well, so you don't have just a list of the games. You can actually have some little thumbnails for those games. Debugging UI, we're not gonna debug, so we're not gonna enable that option. Render window is key window on the top. These are all your hotkey options that you can use if you want. In audio, we're always gonna be selected with DSP HLE fast. HLE is high level emulation, so that's the best option that you can go with. However, there are some games that suffer from high level emulation issues, and if you get audio stuttering, it's worth a shot to use Recompiler as well. So if you know that all of your settings are up to date and you've selected the relevant settings, but you're still having issues with game audio, then select DSP-LLE Recompiler, but only in that scenario, because HLE is pretty fast. It's pretty freaking fast. And this is your volume slider. Audio backend is QBEP. Yep, we're just gonna select that. Nothing to see here. You're never gonna select the interpreter. It's only for debugging purposes. And then you have enable audio stretching if you want to do that. I think the default implementation is pretty good, so we're not gonna customize it. And paths, we have all our paths. These are selected by default in the Dolphin emulator directory, but if you want to specify which path you want, you can actually do that in here. In GameCube, we have IPL settings, skip main menu. Yep. So we would always skip a main menu. We just want to go straight into our game. We don't want to see that firmware booting up, then all those things, which we don't want that. That's why it's grayed out. And slot A is GCI folder. Slot B, you can also select a memory card, and slot C, you can maybe select an advanced game port. So it's kind of trying to emulate those consoles. And in Wii, we have use PAL 60 mode. So if your game is, as I mentioned before, if your game is actually United Kingdom based, so if it's in England, so that's gonna be limited to 50 frames per second, but you can actually use this hack to make sure that it runs at 60. But I believe that instead of using this hack, you can actually make sure that you have the NTSEU ISO instead of the PAL ISO. Install SD card, connect the USB keyboard. So if you want to connect the USB keyboard instead of using the laptop keyboard, then that's up to you. Aspect ratio is here, and then I guess these are pretty good options, pretty self-explanatory, nothing extraordinary here. If you want the USB pass-through devices, you can add them through here. So when would you use these? Sometimes your controllers or other USB devices can't be recognized through Windows, so you can actually manually add them. So then it will show up in here. And sometimes USB can actually detect a connected device and trigger it as just a malfunctioning device. So in that case you would add it through here. In advanced we have CPU options. These are also your experimental options. You can actually use them, but I recommend leaving them at default. In CPU emulation engine we have JIT recompiler. So this is our recompiler, and we're always going to use this because this is the best options. And considering the amounts of repetitions of iterations it has went through, it has gone through it, it's gonna be your best option to use for every single scenario. And you would use the interpreter, cache interpreter and interpreter if you want to debug, if you're debugging some stuff. In CPU emulation engine we have enable manager. So if you want to enable that memory management unit, it's experimental. So if in some case you're getting some specific issues, you can actually enable that, but I would recommend leaving it disabled. The reason is because of the iterations that I mentioned earlier. Most of the approved changes are under the hood, so only just like 2 or 3 games are going to be benefited from turning this on. So I don't recommend using this, but you can, it's there, it's completely experimental. In clock override we have enable emulator CPU clock override. So it's kind of like PS2 emulator. This is the normal frequency where you would run it, but if you want to run it at a bigger frequency, this can give you some performance gains on low-end PC, but keep in mind that your gameplay is not going to be smooth or accurate at all. So sometimes you're going to get performance gains, but sometimes you're going to get pretty slow effects. So I recommend leaving it disabled. But if you have a PC from the 90s or 2000s, then you can actually increase this clock speed. It's the same with the RAM. So you can select the RAM frequency in here, and these are your custom clock options. So if you really want to dig into that nostalgia, or sometimes you can have issues with the game clock. So if you want to make sure that you get a custom clock for GameCube titles, you can select the time and date in here. So that covers our basic settings, and now I want to go into performance related settings regarding the rendering. So let's go to graphics. We have general section, and in general section we have the backend, and in backend we have OpenGL, Direct3D 11, Direct3D 12, Vulkan, and software renderer, and null you would only use in debugging. When you're debugging stuff, OpenGL is the most accurate renderer, but I would recommend using Direct3D 12, which is the best renderer that you can possibly get on this emulator. If you're running on a low-end PC and you don't have the Direct3D 12 enabled, and this happens when you don't have a dedicated graphics card, you only have the iGPU onboard graphics chip, you would use the Direct3D 11. And if you don't have any graphic card at all, but your PC is competent enough, your CPU is actually 9th generation or 10th generation from Intel, you can actually use the software renderer. So this can give you some performance gain sometimes, but I wouldn't recommend using it only if you don't have any system video memory at all. So these are the two options. Direct3D, always recommend Direct3D. And then we have Vulkan. So if your PC actually supports Vulkan, you can use that, but then you have to make sure that your shader compilation settings are in order. So let's first go to Direct3D settings, and then I would go into the Vulkan settings. If there's an adapter, aspect ratio is auto. Never enable VSync because it decreases performance, but if you're having some screen sharing effects, you can actually enable that. Start in full screen if that's up your alley. Show FPS, and these are your pretty self-explanatory settings. UI regarding settings, shader compilation is synchronous. Very recommended for low-end PCs, but asynchronous you can use if you have a high-end GPU especially. So in Direct3D 12, you just select synchronous, but if you're using Vulkan, I'm assuming that you have a high-end PC, then you would use asynchronous. So that's your shader compilation settings and your renderer settings. I'm using a pretty low-end PC, that's why it just gave me an error about Vulkan when I try to select Vulkan. And if you do want to use Vulkan, you can run into errors if your PC is mid-end to low-end, but it does support Vulkan. I have a link in the description. You can download a program and install those Vulkan libraries, which can, in some scenarios, help you with your Vulkan problems. Enhancements section, we have native, so if you want to render the resolution, so it's just native. I think this is a pretty crappy resolution. I would use 2x or at least 720p, and I think it's safe to say that even the low-end PCs can handle the 2x native 720p, but if you're really high-end, you can go up to 1440p. I won't recommend going to 5x, 6x, 7x, or 8x, because at that point it's just there's a lot of smoothing going on. It wants to upscale the resolution, so that's why it wants to make sure that all of those polygons are smooth and sharp, so that's why it's gonna be a lot of unnecessary computational workload, but you're not gonna get that much of accurate rendering. So that's why I would recommend the most that you go to is 4x native, because in the game's original code, it was never intended to run at these higher resolutions. So you're just upscaling those native textures, and it's not really making a difference. It's just increasing your computational workload. In anti-aliasing, we have none, and I think you would select none. If you have a high-end GPU, you can select 2x MSAA, but don't go more than that. Again, unnecessary workload. And anti-scorpion filtering, we have 1x selected. Always keep it to 1x. But if there are some games that are pretty low resolution, some lightweight titles, you can select 2x, 4x. You can select it up till here, so you don't get those effects, and you can actually filter them out. But I think 1x is the sweet spot for most games. Then we have post-processing effect, which is off, but if you want to apply any of these effects, that's up to you. If you're feeling really nostalgic, then you can actually apply the monitor one at 16-bit. Then we have scale EFB. Copy, which is checked, and I recommend leaving it enabled. Only on a low-end PC you would keep it disabled, but I think even on a low-end PC it's safe to keep it enabled always. But if you want to dig into more of those experimental settings, that you can keep it disabled on a low-end PC and see whether your game boots or not. Per pixel lighting, same thing. So it's just gonna make sure that your every single pixel lights up, but I always leave it disabled. And as it says, smoothing out the appearance of lit polygons, making individual triangles less noticeable. So it's an additional workload, and I don't think it's worth enabling that, but I would categorize it as an experimental option. So there you go. Force texture filtering, nope, we already have anti-aliasing and anti-scorpion filtering, so I'm not going to enable that. Widescreen hack, so if you're rendering on 16:9 aspect ratio, but you want to render it on widescreen, then you can disable fog. And then if you don't want the fog effects, you can disable them here. Disable copy filter, arbitrary MIP map detection. So this is your EFB workaround, and you should leave it enabled. Again, this is more in experimental category, but you should always leave it enabled. Force 24-bit color, yep, leave it enabled. It will give us nice resolution and a bigger color palette as well. Stereoscopy, so if you want to render it in 3D, you can, but I don't know why you would. These are all your techniques. I never render it 3D, computational workload. But if you have a 3D enabled monitor, then of course you can, and you can adjust your depth in here and convergence in here. In hacks, we have embedded frame buffer and external frame buffer. So the frame buffer is actually the bitmap of all your graphics. So embedded frame buffer is actually the architecture of Wii and external frame buffer. So these two frame buffers are actually used to store your graphics, and then you can manipulate them as values. So that's how you would render in this emulator. Skip EFB access from CPU, so you would only enable that in a couple of games. because it doesn't give you that much of a performance boost. It does in some really lightweight titles, but in most of the scenarios it's not going to give you any performance gain, so just leave it enabled. Store EFB copies to texture only. So this option in particular, it's actually a fast option, so I recommend keeping it enabled. So what it's gonna do basically, it's just gonna store the emulator frame buffer, the graphics data, to texture only instead of storing it in texture and RAM. So it actually is by using this option you can get some performance gain. But if you want accuracy, then you would have to disable that. So if you have a high-end PC, I recommend disabling that. So what it's gonna do, it's actually gonna go to RAM as well and get textures. But if you leave it disabled, that actually resembles the architecture of the Wii. So that's why it's gonna be more accurate. But if you want to be a little faster, then you can enable that. So I think it all depends on your PC specifications and your personal preference. But I think this emulator has been in development for long enough that you don't have to disable that. Ignore format changes, yep. So if you want to avoid those specific format errors, just leave it enabled. It's not going to have any performance toll or any kind of toll on your performance. Texture cache is accuracy and fast. So we selected it fast, but if you want it to be more accurate, you would select it to save. I don't recommend going all the way here, but I recommend leaving it balanced. But again, it depends on your PC specifications. If you have a high-end PC, you can actually leave it balanced. But if you have a mid-end to low-end PC, I would recommend leaving it to fast. You can also render it at safe if you got the RTX 2080 or 3080. But at that point you're not gonna notice the accuracy gain, because at that point accuracy is pretty minimal. You're not gonna notice that much of a difference. So again, leaving it at fast is the sweet spot. GPU texture encoding, decoding, sorry. In a case where your CPU is low end but you have a high-end GPU for all those custom builds, you would select this one, so it will give you a performance gain because you're using your GPU instead of your CPUs to decode those textures. And then we have an external frame buffer, so it's pretty similar to this one. Store XFP copies to texture only. So I recommend, like, if you're gonna leave it disabled, then you disable this as well. To give you a more accurate rendering, but we're just gonna leave it enabled for now. But if you have a high-end PC, you can leave it both disabled. Immediately present XFP, so if you don't want to route that information, you want to immediately present it without any computation, then you can do that. But it's gonna be all over the place and very inconsistent performance, so I recommend keeping it disabled. Skip presenting duplicate frames, yeah, pretty self-explanatory. We have it enabled. Then we have fast depth calculation, disable bounding box, save texture cache to state. So these are the other options, and you should always leave them enabled regardless of your specifications. Then we have vertex rounding. It can help in some of the glitches that you might suffer in a number of games, but again, it's an experimental category, so leave it disabled. And in advanced, we have all these debugging options that we're not going to go into. In utility, we have load custom textures. So the resource package manager, you can actually use load custom texture and prefetch custom textures instead of you loading them after booting the game. Disable EFB RAM copies, you can actually enable that, and only enable that on high-end PCs. Sometimes it can give you a little bit more accurate performance, but I would categorize it as experimental. Then we have texture dumping. We don't want to dump any texture, and if you want to use codeless lossless codec, then you can use that. But I recommend using this bitrate method instead of the codec method, because it's a little bit high-end, so it might increase the workload. And then we have miscellaneous settings and defer EFB cache invalidation and experimental options. Okay, so that was all of your options or graphic options. Now I want to talk about the controllers for a second. It's not going to be a second, it's probably going to be longer. In port 1 we have standard controller, which is basically what you would select if you want to play with a mouse and a keyboard. If you want to use the GameCube adapter from Wii U, you can use that, and you can use all these other accessories. So on port 1 you can have the controllers, you can have up to 4 ports. Port 2 you can have the steering wheel and you can actually use these in conjunction, but you just have to map them. And then port 3 you can have dance mat, and port 4 you can have GBA. So I'm just gonna keep them disabled for now because I don't have these accessories. If you go into standard controller, then we have our devices. So if you want all of your devices to show up here, you can select that, but I would recommend using the direct input 0 keyboard mouse, and you can actually refresh the list if you just plugged in a device or paired up a device with Bluetooth. So these are all your keys that you can use, and there's our dead zone. You can actually select the dead zone. Which of this do you not want to trigger? So that input is not going to be sent. Whatever you select in the dead zone, it's going to be ignored, and you can actually calibrate this if you want. So let's try calibrating this. So press calibrate. So I don't know why it gave me this error. So calibrate up, down, left, right, up, left, down, right, down, left. So yep, our calibration is successful. So finish calibration. You can actually load, save and delete different profiles. So if you want to put different games and you have different controls set up for each game, then you can use that. So this is pretty self-explanatory. Let's say GameCube for Wii U. So we don't have anything connected right now, so that's why it's grayed out. So let's leave it to none. And then we have V modes pass through a Bluetooth adapter, or you can use the Emulator V adapter. This method, the first method, has a lot less latency in my personal experience. So sync real V modes and pair them and reset. So if you want to use that. But in some scenarios you can get an error, so you would use the second method, the Emulator V Bluetooth adapter. So use that. Real balance board enables speaker data. We're not going to use these. Connect V modes for emulator controllers and continuous scanning. If you want it to be continuously scanning, it can increase the workload, but if you want the interval ones, you can actually refresh like every 2 to 3 minutes. Then we have background, pretty self-explanatory. Alternate input sources. Let's go into here. So this is a DSU client. So remember the DSU for Windows or any other agents that you can install for controllers, you can actually route them in here, and then you can use your DualShock or other controllers that you might have through this one. That's your hotkey settings, only for your function keys, and then you have free lock settings. I never used a camera with this one. So yeah, that was a detailed look in your emulator Dolphin. Now I would include a gameplay for testing purposes. I would love to do that, but I did that with Xenia emulator and my video got age restricted. I was afraid of that, and then I had to cut that part out, so I really apologize that I can't upload that type of gameplay. I have no idea, this policy is so stupid. Anyways, now I'm gonna tell you the recommended settings for low-end PCs. So first up we go to config, and when we go to general, dual core enable, yep, interface pretty good, GameCube, Wii, use that, and in advanced we make sure that it's connected. Again, if you have a really low-end PC, then you might want to select a higher frequency. Then that's done. In graphics, I would use, for a really low-end PC, I would use Direct 3D 11. For mid-end to low-end PC, I would use DirectX 3D12 and just a dedicated graphics card. Enhancements. For a really low-end PC, I would say native. For a low-end to mid-end PC, I would say 2x. Anti-aliasing none and 1x off. And leave all these options enabled. That looks pretty good. For high-end PCs, you would do the same thing. In general, I think these ones are gonna be pretty much unchanged. And then if you go to graphics, I would recommend using Vulkan. So if you have a really high-end PC, and then use asynchronous Uber shaders, or you can use DirectX 3D12 as well. In enhancements, you can select up to 4x. So you can actually render it to full HD, anti-aliasing 2x MSAA. So that's pretty much it. 3D scoping is off. And if you have a really high-end PC, you can use your GPU. So for the newer architecture, GDDR5X, you can actually use this option, and it's gonna give you a lot of performance. Then I think these are gonna be left like this. So that's pretty much it, guys. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial. I hope it was helpful. I'll catch you guys later.